Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're talking about progressions and regressions. And essentially what we're going to talk about is how to scale exercises up and down appropriately. So if you are caught off guard with an athlete or a client coming in and they are injured, uh, this is how you can basically accomplish the same goal of a lift that you had for the day, but maybe scale it back in complexity or intensity, something along those lines that's going to make it a little bit more appropriate for that day. So to quote the strength coach, Louis Simmons, we don't want to train maximally. We also want to train minimally. We want to train optimally. So in the effort to train optimally, these progressions and regressions are going to help us find the appropriate movement for ourselves, our clients, our athletes, whoever. So yeah, let's go on. Let's proceed here. So what are some factors for the progression? And we've talked a little bit about this already, but let's dive back in and kind of build our philosophy a little bit more on it. When were they born? How old are they? Where's the hormone levels, the maturity? What are their goals? What about that risk to reward ratio? So when I think about that biological age, my concern is that maybe we're putting emphasis on high intensity exercises for maybe populations who don't have the proper hormones to actually adapt by way of growing muscle mass. So take our prepubescent crowd or our geriatric crowd. Those populations are just not really coursing or teaming with testosterone, and to the point where they're going to have a whole lot of muscle mass from a type of like maybe a bodybuilding type routine or a high intensity, high volume strength workout. So just keep in mind who you're working with and whether or not you're sort of beating a dead horse. So with maybe that younger crowd, maybe you do those same exercises, but you do it more teaching intensive. And again, if they're younger, they probably have less experience as well. And if you've got an older crowd, not that they can't benefit from strength training and possibly even add some muscle mass, but look at that risk to reward ratio. If they're a little bit easier to injure as well as being harder to or slower to healing, that may change where that risk to reward ratio kind of lies. And then as far as maturity, putting a few hundred pounds on someone's back is a sort of a nerve-wracking experience. And if you're doing that just because a 14 or 15-year-old might be physically able to do that, does that really mean that that's what's best for them? Just because you want to put something on your social media page, that's not really, that's something to maybe rethink. Now, strength work is going to be important for, let's say it's a 15-year-old male football player. Strength work is going to be important and beneficial, but then you want to start thinking about maybe that risk to reward ratio is 400 pounds or 500 pounds better than 400 pounds? You may want to start just rethinking how safe that is. And if maybe they have other movements that they could work on that are not quite as risky. And then looking at that training age, again, I see all the time, I see 20-year-old men and women who look outstanding. They look as if they have been on a organized regimen of nutrition and training for the last decade. And sometimes they don't know a thing. They haven't had organized training in their background at all. It's just sort of a combination of hard work, doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and genetics. And so they kind of fool you. They come in, they look like they've almost mastered this whole exercise science thing, but they really need to start from ground zero almost. And then on the other hand, sometimes you see 15 and 16-year-olds who have already had several years of top-end coaching. Perhaps they're a coach's child, or they just have been around the right coaches for whatever reasons. So that training age makes a big difference on what you might do as well. So I will admit that I've had a college football player. He played at a junior college, So he went from high school to a junior college over to a 4-year university. And he probably about 350 pounds and strong body weight and pretty strong. And on the first day that he ever squatted, so he had never back squatted before. And at this point, he's about a junior in college. He had never back squatted before. And at this point, he had never back squatted before. And we ended up putting almost 450 pounds on his back on the first day. And we got lucky. There was no injury, no soreness. He just so happened to be sort of a unique character that was very thick and very strong and capable of squatting 450 pounds on essentially his first squat workout ever. If I could do it again, I probably wouldn't even think about going over 315 pounds because that risk to reward ratio. He probably would have benefited way more from doing maybe 5 sets of 3 at 225 pounds, just something where we could teach him and get his repetitions better and better. Although I will admit he had an awesome, just natural squat technique. He could sit very low, and even 450 pounds looked like he could have squatted more. So there was a little bit of logic and rationale behind it. But now that I'm a little bit older and I view my risk to reward ratio has changed a little bit, I would not have done that again today. But sometimes you just get weird anomalies like that. And then also looking at maybe athletes who have been lifting in traditional programs for several years. Maybe they need a new stimulus. So maybe they have been back squatting for several years, but not front squatting or not split squatting. So if the back squat, for a lot of people, the back squat is going to be sort of their top tier of squatting patterns, because that's essentially where we lift the most weight. But if an athlete has already back squatted hundreds or thousands of times, maybe mixing it up will actually drive a new stimulus and allows them to work on their weaknesses. So on our lower body push day, we talked about how that front squat drives your center of mass forward and challenges your abdomen and your core a whole lot more in a unique way. Well, sometimes if that's your weak link, then shifting over might cause a new stimulus, which causes a new adaptation. And then when you come back to back squatting down the road, you may squat even more, if that's your goal, if that's going to be beneficial to you. And again, these progressions and regressions are great for a lot of reasons, just for general training, but also for training on the fly. So if an athlete comes in and they have an injury, maybe let's stick with that squat discussion. Let's say it's one of our female swimmers and it's a front squat day, and she comes in and she twisted her ankle walking through the parking lot, or she was playing a little volleyball over the weekend and that ankle's unhappy. Well, maybe front squatting is not the best idea for her that day. Well, what are some alternatives? Well, that's when you turn to these regressions and progressions and kind of look at what your beliefs are. And so instead, maybe you end up having her do a rear foot elevated squat, or a step up, or maybe you go sit her in a single leg press. A sort of today is going to be a little bit more personalized with your philosophy and your beliefs, but we're going to talk our way through a couple of different examples and just kind of grow our philosophies and talk about it today. Yeah, so if an athlete comes in with an injury, then that way you don't really have to spend much time thinking. You just know kind of where your substitute lift is going to go to. Or if you get to the point that you have assistant coaches, they're going to be able to sort of read your mind because they know what your regressions and progressions are. And yeah, so we'll leave it at that. How about resources? You may have a progression, a set of progressions of movements that you really like, but you may not have the equipment to accomplish that. And so it's time to sort of change and to develop a new batch of progressions. And you want that to help you achieve your goals, right? So spending a little bit of time thinking through this, it usually ends up paying off from what I've seen. So I would definitely encourage us all to build some progressions for at different movements. The 14 movement patterns that we've talked about already, with the upper body pushes, the upper body pulls, for both horizontal and vertical, and then the lower body pushes and pulls. So it would not be a bad idea to make progressions for really each of those movement patterns. And then that competition season, what time of year is it for them? Yeah, there's definitely movement patterns and batches of movements that I use in my line of progressions. So if I'm out of season, all right, so let's say I've got my movement patterns here, and here's my most complex, kind of challenging one here at the top, and my simplest one is going to be down here. So if it is let's say it's a squatting pattern, maybe this is going to be my back squat. Maybe I'm basing it off of intensity, because on my back squat, I'm typically going to handle more weight than on any other variation of squatting. So maybe at the very top it's back squatting, and at the bottom, let's say it's a med ball infant squat. So you actually hold a medicine ball against your forehead, not very hard or heavy. You're not straining the neck. You're just putting your center mass right over your feet. So medicine ball to forehead and squatting down. Now, in between, there's going to be different variations. There'll be like a front squat, a dumbbell goblet squat, a kettlebell front rack squat. Well, when I'm out of season, if my athletes have been trained, if they've got a good training age, a good biological age, I'm probably going to spend more time on the top section here. So that's when I'm out of season, I'm going to spend more time doing back squats and front squats, because I can handle a bigger central nervous system batch of stress. I can risk low back injury. I don't want to risk it, but I know that risking it now out of season, if I get a little tweak that kind of bothers me for a couple of weeks, there's not multiple football games occurring during that space and time. So out of season, I'm going to take a little bit more risks. And then in season, now maybe I'm not doing the medicine ball baby squat, but I might be doing things like a dumbbell goblet squat or a kettlebell front rack squat, or a host of unilateral squat patterns, which I'll dive back into that soon. So that's going to be in season. So remember, as we're exercise scientists, what we really do is we sort of manage the overall stress levels. So it's our job that when stress is high outside the weight room, kind of like a seesaw, we lower the stress in the weight room, and vice versa. When we know the stress is not too high outside the weight room, that's our time. That's kind of like the iron is hot. Let's strike when the iron is hot, and let's raise our stress levels within the weight room. So knowing what time of year it is for them is very important. And we'll talk more about that. We have some programming and periodization discussions coming up in the future. So I'll try not to go on too big a tangent on the in-season, out-of-season stuff today. Really quickly, I wanted to mention Charlie Weingroff. He released a set of DVDs entitled Regressions and Lateralizations. He is a strength coach, a physical therapist, and athletic trainer. With his knowledge background, he put together some advice and some instructions on how to create batches of movement, progressions, and regressions that will allow you to work towards the same goal, but training at an optimal movement pattern. And also, because of his skill set, a lot of that is more rehab and recovery based. But the logic, we're going to borrow the logic of it and try to make our own progressions for inside the weight room. All right, so here we go on that squat pattern, progressions and regressions. So let's say our back squat is our head honcho movement. Well, what's the argument for that? Why is the back squat the top movement? I can think of two two ideas really quickly. One is that you're going to handle more weight there. It's your biggest risk. It's your movement with the biggest risk, but also the biggest reward. And so why is it? And so it's riskier and it's heavier. So that's kind of why it's at the top. It's got one of the best, if I could do one movement on there really, really well, I'd want it to be the back squat. But all those other little movements that lead up to it have benefit. If you have someone who's never squatted before, doing the medicine ball baby squat with a med ball against the forehead, not a bad idea. A lot of times I will skip that and I'll go to a dumbbell goblet squat, which tells me two things. It tells me their squat pattern, that they're capable of getting low and meeting some squat standards. And it also gives me a little idea of how strong or not strong their upper body might be. If they are unable to manage holding maybe a 50-pound dumbbell, and that's the limiting factor, maybe I don't need them. Maybe I don't need to be focusing on squatting so hard, but maybe I really need to build that upper body. Conversely, sometimes they'll end up holding a 100-pound dumbbell and their legs don't get any work, but with 100 pounds, it's a little bit more fatiguing and challenging than 50 pounds. So especially if I have maybe a male wrestler, if he's unable to hold a 100-pound dumbbell to do 10 goblet squats, that's a little bit of a milestone. Whereas my female wrestlers, I'd be looking at their weight classes a little bit more. Some of them, that 50-pound dumbbell might really be a challenge, and others, I should be pretty demanding of it because they are going to need both upper and lower body strength. And then you just look at different populations to sort of decide exactly how challenging that goblet squat's going to be. And then you can move from there to a 2 kettlebell rack squat. So taking a kettlebell and resting the bell head on the outside of the forearm, and you're going to be squatting right there into our front squat, and then finally into our back squat. So that's a squat progression, but this one is based off of probably intensity, the amount of weight that one is going to be able to hold. You could just as easily make it about stability, in which case your back squat would almost be at the bottom. So let's do a few tiers, and this time we'll put the back squat at the bottom. Well, let's do the leg press machine. So we've got our leg press machine. And then let's go to back squat. And then to make that back squat less stable, you could back squat on an unstable surface. But honestly, I've done that in the past. I've experimented with a little bit, and I've never really seen that it raises the reward that much more than the risk. So when I'm going bilateral, I don't usually fudge around with the funky surfaces, like maybe a spongy flooring, or back in the mid 2000s, I was squatting pretty respectable weight, like in the mid 200s. I would stand up on a Bosu ball to do the squats with that because I saw other trainers doing it, and the logic that this is an unstable surface and you create more stability, that logic resonated with me, and it was definitely challenging. But when I think back to climbing onto a Bosu ball that is turned upside down and, risking rolling ankles with all that weight, and then to get off, I'd actually jump and widen my stance to land on the ground. Just not very safe, not a very safe approach there. And my squats, when I was on top of the ball, were probably not biomechanically sound. So just, again, going back to why, know why you're doing something. So back squat. So instead of back squatting on an unstable surface, let's look to maybe going unilateral. So 2 legs involved would be a bilateral movement. So let's go to unilateral now. So from our back squat, we might go to a a front foot elevated split squat. So a small box or a stack of a couple of plates out in front of you, and putting one foot on top of it and the other leg is back, providing a support leg, and just bending that back knee in and out of a split squat. And from that front foot elevated split squat, we would go to maybe both feet on the ground, just call that a split squat. And then to reduce the stability again, maybe we go to a rear foot elevated split squat. So now we're probably using less weight on that top movement, but we're creating the most stability. So we've created a less stable environment with each movement. And when our stability decreases within a movement, the body has to raise the amount of stabilization that we perform. So you can do quite a few different progressions, and it's kind of what you're working on. If your emphasis for the current block is to grow core strength and promote and produce as much muscle mass as possible, the back squat really might be a great alternative for you. If your current progression or current goal is to maybe do some teaching, but also do some stabilization, if you're building sort of a ground base for movement for moving forward, doing some unilateral progressions like this may not be a bad idea, because if you can get someone doing deep RFE squats with quality and control, that's going to help them when they go to a bilateral, is that their hip mobility is going to be in a better way. From what I've seen, is that it's going to promote better hip mobility, deeper squats, doing standardized movements, and they're going to have stronger legs. So the RFE, the split squats are not going to challenge the core quite as much. Now there is going to be some unique stabilization going on, but you're going to be handling such lighter weights compared to the bilateral movements that the anti-flexion and anti-extension that's going on is not quite as extreme as it is on a bilateral movement. So your principles determine your methods when it comes to progressions. And let's look at the bottom of the slide to start. A quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson is, "The man who grasps principles can successfully handle his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." And ladies, I'm sure Ralph Waldo Emerson would include women in this as well. So I don't mean to leave you out with all of my football references and this quote. I see out there, ladies, I appreciate you. But just keep in mind that that once you master your principles, when you know why you're doing something, you can basically just roll through different methods. So if you've got a great rationale for why you want to front squat, and you go into the weight room that day and there's no available barbells, well, you could get back in your car and go home like a goof, or look at the principles of why you want to front squat. Okay, well, I really believe that we need to grow our anterior core strength. I want to grow our triple extension, that quad development. Okay, so if we can't front squat, what could we maybe do instead? Oh, all right, maybe the dumbbell goblet squat is acceptable now. It's a regression of movements and it's not going to be as heavy, but maybe you can regress to a different movement with less weight, but you could increase reps and you could gain that similar stimulus and really still check the box of whatever principle you were trying to train that day, just with a different method. All right, so let's look at our principles on the left. We'll work through these. We'll pick up the pace a little bit here. All right, so complexity, single joint, closed chain movement. So I'm missing a little D on there, closed chain. So our method would be maybe a seated leg extension machine, right? So very, very simple. And that's going to help pick on our quads. And then to make it more complex, so maybe our single leg press would be down here, or our single leg extension, excuse me, would be down here. And then we'd have something like so let's do a leg extension here. And then here would be maybe a backwards slid drag. And then here would be maybe a trap bar squat. And then from there, we can go to a front squat. And on this one, we will stick with the front squat being our top progression here. So we're not going to draw one out for each of these, but we're just going to talk real quickly. So for stability, yeah, you could go on a bilateral machine, go over to the YMCA and go and do some of the Nautilus work, bilateral machines. Or maybe you're out doing free weights, and that perturbation is maybe having a partner tap on basically creating a inconsistent instability. So you might have someone sort of make their prayer hands and arms out straight and drop into a squat position, and a partner comes over and does perturbations. So it's basically like kind of chopping at them and trying to make their arms move and make their core dip. But that lifter is going to create stability against that. So that would be an example of that. You could also have the lifter close their eyes if you want to really get crazy. That really makes things interesting with the inability to predict where the hits are coming from. About speed, going from slow to fast. When we go slow, we have the ability to think through it and do quality work. And when we go fast, things get crazier. If we get off balance, we usually can't right ourselves and things like that. So going slow is a good thing, but if we're athletes, we need to be able to go fast. And then your implement, so whether it's a barbell, dumbbell, machine, kettlebell, sandbag, slosh pipe. So this one kind of makes me think about maybe some funny, goofy implements that I've seen in the past. So your implement, yeah, maybe a slosh pipe, or maybe a asymmetrically loaded implement, just to challenge you a little bit extra. The resistance, constant versus variable. And we're going to talk more about variable resistance a little bit later, because this is such a profound opportunity to grow and challenge our lifters. And then instruction, clear versus vague. Yeah, sometimes you may not get the best coaching or give the best coaching, and sort of figuring it out along the way is a good challenge. Hopefully not like when I was a freshman in high school and I wanted to be a pole vaulter, and they told me to look it up on the internet and then gave me a pole vault and sent me over to the pits. So that did not end well. But so hopefully you get a little bit more instruction than that. Intensity, lightweight versus heavyweight, and volume, low volume versus high volume. So taking some of these make for better progressions than others. So taking a progression where we put low weight down here and high weight up there, that's not very complex. We can all sort of instinctually agree that adding weight is a progression, but that's sort of a natural progression. So let's not do much not focus too much on intensity progressions, because that's sort of like an underlying name of the game. But the complexity, stability, speed, the implement, and the resistance type, those would help us really create the progressions and regressions that we like. And just more ideas, just more parameters for helping guide your ideas for progressions and regressions. One is keep it simple. So if you have simple progressions that are logical, that you can defend, that you can rationalize, that allows us to trust the process. And then with your movements and all of these, when we look at that, be able to modify, think about all these variety of principles here. With those, for that variety of options, surely we can be able to modify, right? And then here's a few examples for different movement patterns. So the squat and hinge, maybe you're just going to start with maybe a PVC hinge pattern. So holding a stick behind your neck and behind your lower back, so it lines up with your spine. So it reduces your ability to squat, and it forces hinging. And you might go from there, and a couple of progressions later, you might be on a trap bar. And with that trap bar, you can do squats or you can do deadlifts. So it's really about your muscle action, or your joint action, excuse me. So on the trap bar, you're standing inside of the bar and the weight is just out to the side of you. If your hips go back, it's more of a hinge. And if your hips just go down, it's more of a squat. And I'll pause this if you're interested in reading through some more of these options. But you can kind of see, hopefully, how some of these patterns of progressions match up with some of these principles back here. And before we move on, I just want to come back here one more time. Read that quote at the bottom one more time. The man who grasps principles can successfully handle his own methods. The man who tries methods, ignore principles, is sure to have trouble. So with that in mind, if you are doing a movement, if you're doing a single arm kettlebell swing because you saw it on the internet and it looks cool, that's great. But also think that maybe that's not the best place to start. Maybe two hands with one rep at a time. So, knowing your principles before your methods, just beware of doing a grab bag of different methods and jamming it all together, and then being surprised when people get hurt or not making improvements. All right, we're going to do just a quick anatomy review before we get back to our variable resistance discussion. All right, our muscles come in bundles. Our bundles come in fascicles. Our fascicles come in fibers. Our fibers come in myofibrils. And that's about as far as we need to know here. And here, we can probably take that slide out. Let's just go from the muscle fiber over to the motor neuron. That motor neuron is going to innervate a certain amount of muscle fibers. So one motor neuron innervates right around 50, I believe around 50 muscle fibers. So, and it's going to vary whether it's slow twitch or fast twitch. So slow twitch help us do our finer motor pattern movements, like writing freehand. So those are going to be slow twitch muscle fibers, and those motor neurons are going to grab onto fewer numbers of myofibrils and muscle fibers. But our fast twitch muscles come in bigger clumps, and those help us with our gross motor patterns. So we tend to get more muscle fibers involved in that in that motor neuron that fires, we tend to get more muscle fibers. All right, let's see if I can get rid of this random P that's on here before I keep talking here. I know you guys are distracted by it, so am I. Boom, we did it. All right, nice work. All right, yeah, that P was just a typo, so don't worry about it. Okay, so looking at those that muscle becomes a muscle fiber, which is innervated by our motor neurons. Well, our motor neurons are not always firing on all cylinders. They're not always revved up to the highest level, right? So how can we get more motor neurons in the game? That's potentiation, right? That's neural activation. So when we send a signal from our brain down to our muscle, at some point it will fully potentiate the motor neurons that are involved, and then we'll start calling on new motor neurons that are maybe a little bit dormant. So that's where variable resistance comes into play. With variable resistance, you're typically looking, when it comes to free weights, you're typically looking at either bands or chains. And what's going to happen with the bands and chains, as that weight is elevated, the band will get stretched like a rubber band. And just like when you stretch a rubber band out, it pulls tighter and tighter. So the further you're stretching that band, the harder it's pulling back on you. And if you have chains on the bar, what happens is the chain accrues on the ground and sits on the ground. And as the bar elevates, the chain links come off the floor one at a time, and they add more weight to the bar. And this is beneficial for quite a few reasons. One is that it promotes rate of force development. So a lot of times when we're lifting, we get past the sticking point, past the hard point, and we sort of ease off the gas. You know, it'd be kind of funny to punch your elbows into hyperextension every time you're doing a bench press, or to squat to the point that the bar pops off your back at the top every rep. That'd be a little silly. But when we have enough variable resistance, we almost have to do that, because instead of having normal sticking points, the weight is actually easier and lighter at the bottom. And as we come up through our sticking points, it gets harder towards the top. So it sort of mirrors our biomechanical advantage, and it makes the reps harder from start to finish, as opposed to having the reps that get easier at the top. You'll actually have more weight on your back or in your hands at the top of the reps, where normally it feels very easy or light. So very few people fail a squat or bench press at the top of the range of motion. The vast majority are going to fail at the bottom. So now what we're doing is we're promoting force and work throughout the whole range of motion. And what this is going to do is it's going to promote a greater neurological impetus from the brain to the muscle, and it's going to help drive motor neuron recruitment. And then you have more muscle fibers that are activated, and then you can train those muscle fibers the rest of the day, or maybe even a following day or two after that. And this is beneficial for strength and power athletes in particular, but anybody that's lifting and just wants to get a little bit more out of the lift that day. So it sort of solves what is essentially the one weakness of free weights, is that we are able to overcome those sticking points, and then the rep is almost a waste of time outside of that, just because it's so easy. So this sort of helps solve that problem, and also has some neurological benefits. So looking at myself and the coach that I'm with there, that's Louis Simmons, who founded and runs Westside Barbell, which is a powerlifting facility out in Columbus, Ohio. And Westside Barbell has popularized the 3 styles of lifts of max effort, dynamic effort, and repetition effort. And the goal with each one of those lifts is to eventually help an athlete get stronger. Now, the max effort, and each of these can be done with variable resistance. So the 2 are different. Westside Barbell is renowned for popularizing variable resistance and using it to basically become what is known as the strongest gym in the world, where they have essentially the strongest men and women on the planet go and lift at Westside Barbell and are Westside Barbell athletes. Max effort would be training very near maximal effort, so almost maxing out, leaving just a little bit of room in the tank or a little bit of weight that's not lifted in order to stimulate additional motor neurons. And then those additional motor neurons and those additional muscle fibers that are activated are then trained. And the goal with that is to grow how many muscle fibers we regularly have access to. And so that is a slow and challenging lift. Dynamic effort usually involves anywhere from 6 to 12 sets of quickly lifted weights. And the goal here is to really maximize our type 2 muscle fibers and motor neurons that innervate those muscle fibers. And the goal there is to, again, wake up motor neurons without destroying joints and muscle fibers. So this is to help, again, it's another way of activating those motor neurons to more regularly access the muscle fibers that they innervate. And then repetition effort would be kind of digging in for the long haul and doing a lot of reps on different exercises. So this doesn't have the same neurological effect as the dynamic and max effort, but this is where we're going to take those muscle fibers that we've activated and those motor neurons that we've activated, and we're going to help build in our mind muscle connection and the use of those muscle fibers. So if you think back to the slides we had on, well, let's just jump back a couple of slides. Here it is. So if you think back to when we kind of talked about this a little bit in one of our other discussions, is this myelination of cells of this myelination of neurons. When we use a neuron regularly, we're going to myelinate it, and that is going to strengthen the connection along that wire. And when we activate new motor neurons and we're activating new muscle fibers, by doing the repetition effort, that helps us lay this down. So kind of like going in and to Spanish class on day 1, you may not know a single word, but after hearing it enough times, our body and our nervous system, our brain, will lay down. Aside from creating some new connections, we will strengthen those connections by use of myelination. And that repetition effort helps us do the same thing, and it helps us pick on those muscle fibers to grow, whether it's their mitochondria content or their size, but that's going to help us kind of change some of the things that have to do with this type of anatomy here. Let's get rid of that little sketch there. So when we're doing that repetition effort, that's going to help us strengthen the connection to the new motor neurons, and it's going to help us grow those muscle fibers. And that's all we've got for today, guys. So that is progressions and regressions. And the big focus here would be to just know your principles about why you're doing exercises, and then using different methods to accomplish your goals. All right, we'll see you next time.